I'm Oscar Rederer, Director of Instructional Emerging Technologies at Franklin and Marshall College. In the next 10 minutes or so, I'll be sharing some guidelines, tips, and good and not so good examples of developing, designing, and delivering presentations that I've learned from reading, listening to, and observing experts across various disciplines and practices. This is a rich topic, often the focus of entire workshops. Good books are available on the subject as well. I know, because I've read many of them. I'll share a few of my favorites with you in the course of this presentation. The Internet's also a rich and diverse resource for discovering all sorts of information on the subject of effective presentations. Just ask the Google. A quick search of the words effective presentations returned almost 3 million hits from the search engine. Some sites offer practical advice. Others provide examples of best practices. Some approach the subject seriously. Others use humor to make a point. 10 minutes isn't much time to dig deeply into the subject, so we'll be moving quickly. My goal is to share a few basic guidelines and tips for thinking about the process from beginning to end, from concept to delivery, and to share some resources for you to explore in more detail as time and interest permit. So let's get going. For me, there are 4 basic steps to the process of making effective presentations. The 4 basic building blocks, the 4 P's, are planning, producing, practicing, and presenting. Planning the presentation. What's your message? Designing and producing any visual aids for your presentation. Rehearsing the presentation, and finally the purpose of the previous 3 steps, the presentation itself. Step 1. Planning. Let's look briefly at what to consider in the planning phase. Plan to plan. Knowing exactly what you want to say is a key component to making an effective presentation. A presentation is like a story. It has a beginning, a middle, and an end. Answer the basic questions. What are the goals for your presentation? Who's the audience? How much time do you have? Most presentation experts encourage the use of paper and pencil during the planning phase, or a whiteboard, or sticky notes, or a bar napkin. Just don't open PowerPoint yet. Plan out the structure of your presentation. Use a storyboard to create a basic visual structure of your story. To oversimplify the structure, think about the following guide to telling your story. You've heard this before. Tell the audience what you're going to be saying, the beginning. Tell them, the middle. Then tell them what you just said, the end. Focus on the main points. Ask yourself, if your audience could only remember 3 or 4 things about your presentation, what would you want those to be? Each presentation is different. Not all presentations require multimedia. For a small group discussing data-intensive materials, for example, a handout of the material with a give-and-take discussion might be best. Other situations might call for a whiteboard or flip charts. Each presentation is distinct, and this presentation will focus on situations where multimedia is a good fit. Okay. So now we can put down the pencil and paper and turn on the computer. In this illustration of the process of designing an effective presentation, we've decided to use visuals, slides, to support the message. So we open our presentation design software, probably PowerPoint or Keynote. But beware. Presentation experts say this is where many of us get into trouble and often leads to the dreaded presentation malaise suffered by many audiences, death by PowerPoint. But PowerPoint or Keynote, or whatever your slideware application of choice, are just the tools. They can be used effectively with appropriate design methods or ineffectively with inappropriate methods. Let's start with the basics. Consider appropriate use of font size and style. Be sure the audience can read or see what you put on your slides. Don't put too much information on a slide. Nancy Duarte, communications expert and author, says it's okay to have clear space on slides. Clutter is a failure of design, she states in her book Slideology, The Art and Science of Creating Great Presentations. Use of color, picture, animations, and transitions to enhance or help clarify your message. But use such effects appropriately. Don't overdo it. You'll find in every design book or resource on the topic that simplicity is a universal design concept. As I mentioned earlier, the Internet offers a rich resource for information on basic presentation slide design guidelines. Some of the best examples are non-examples. Good examples of bad slide design. Alexei Kaptrev makes the point that guidelines are simply that, guidelines, rules of thumb, principles with broad application that are not intended to be strictly accurate or reliable for every situation. In his popular online presentation, Death by PowerPoint and How to Avoid It, Kaptrev stresses simple design over rules for simple design. In general, use common sense. If it doesn't look right to use, it probably isn't. Get some feedback. Ask a friend or colleague. The best advice is probably to err on the side of simplicity. Slides are for speaker support, to reinforce what the speaker is saying, not as a substitute for the presenter. Avoid overloading slides with too much information or filling the space with reams of text and hard-to-see data. Don't overuse the bullet point, and don't use your slide as your script. That is, avoid reading your slides to the audience. Avoid chart junk. Edward Tufte coined the term in his 1983 book, The Visual Display of Quantitative Information. Chart junk refers to all visual elements in charts and graphs that are not necessary to comprehend the information represented on the graph, or that distract the viewer from this information. So what do we as presenters want to produce? Gar Reynolds, in his book Presentation Zen, encourages us to think of three components to a presentation: the slides the audience sees, the notes the presenter sees, and handouts to be taken away. Reynolds suggests thinking of a presentation in this way frees the presenter from feeling the need to put too much information directly on the slides. Slides are slides, documents are documents. They're not the same thing. Attempts to merge them result in what Reynolds calls the slide-ument. Much death by PowerPoint suffering could be eliminated, Reynolds says, if presenters clearly separated the two in their own minds before they even started planning their talks. Let's review some tips for producing good presentation visuals. Keep your slides simple. Employ good design techniques. Don't overload your slides with too much information. Use speaker notes and handouts to reinforce your slides. Avoid slide-uments and chart junk. Step 3. Practice the presentation. I won't say much about this stage of the process, except to note practice is an important step in the process of making effective presentations. In the words of Ray Bradbury, practice, practice, practice. Practice will help with timing and pacing of the presentation. Test your equipment beforehand if possible. For some people, practicing a presentation helps build confidence. I've already gone through this presentation several times. The actual presentation will go just fine. And lastly, the presentation itself. Have you heard this Jerry Seinfeld bit? According to most studies, people's number one fear is public speaking. Number 2 is death. If this is correct, it means to the average person, if you want to go to a funeral, you're better off in the casket than doing the eulogy. But statistics or not, the show must go on. The story must be told. In addition to FDR's advice, let me offer a few final suggestions. Speak in a clear voice and loud enough so everyone in the room, even those in the back, can hear you. Look at and speak to your audience. Don't read from your slides. Have a backup plan in case the technology gods are not friendly on the day of your presentation. And finally, have fun. Hopefully you're speaking on a topic you know something about and have some interest in. After you put all this time and energy into a presentation, you may want to share it with others as a post-presentation resource for your original audience, or possibly to post it on the internet for others to see. On websites like Google Docs, YouTube, and SlideShare, it's easy to upload your finished presentation to the cloud, and it's free. For example, you can export a Keynote presentation to YouTube directly from within the Keynote application. If you're using Google Docs to deliver a presentation, then you have the option for people in different locations to view your presentation simultaneously. Viewers can choose to move from slide to slide on their own, or follow along with the presenter who is controlling the presentation. Finally, making effective presentations is an art and a science, a skill that can be learned and improved. For some, it's also a profession. So be aware of good design around you. Listen to the pros, the real design professionals like the Tuftes, the Gar Reynolds, and the Nancy Duartes, and observe really good presenters like many of the gifted speakers at the TED Talks. What were the 4 things I'd hoped you get from this brief presentation? That all 4 parts of the process, planning, producing, practicing, and presenting, are important to the whole, making effective presentations.